never had a land use as big as agriculture. It seems, if you look at the map, to have found itself primarily into the white area. Heck, it defines the white areas, right? It's the southern part of Alberta. And some areas, if you look at red, that's where a much greater percentage of those townships are consumed in agriculture. What I find interesting about this graph is, you notice how it kind of levels off? Well, the true story is quite different. It's actually growing every year and expanding. But now actually agriculture is getting smaller, so that's the paradox. How is it that cultivated lands continue to expand every year and the amount of agricultural land goes down? So we'll go back to that question. What about cattle? Population's gone up and down, but primarily up. So we've got, what, 6 million head of cattle today. And here you get to see their distribution, and their distribution reminds us that cattle need water and they need food, and if you're growing forage crops, maybe you should want to grow them close to cattle. Since the very first quarter section was developed in Alberta for agriculture, something started growing into it. The moment Mom and Pa turned over that native prairie and put it into cultivated crops, I bet you they lived in a house, and that house had to go somewhere, and some land had to be consumed by that house. Well, if you actually track the amount of land that is being lost from agriculture every year, it's grown from 0, when there wasn't any agriculture, to where we are today. We lose 15,000 hectares per year in the province of Alberta of agricultural land. And most of you probably look at the number and go, there's just no way. So what's consuming 15,000 hectares of agricultural land that was land last year? Urban sprawl, transportation, rural residential, the footprint of the hydrocarbon sector. And it's going to grow further. So, agriculture is expanding, but at the same time it's being eaten into. The rate at which it's being consumed by other land uses exceeds the rate at which it's expanding, so agriculture now is basically holding its own or starting to decline in area. Now this is really interesting. Here we're looking at the amount of crop area per person. If you go back to 1905, we didn't have many people and we didn't have much agricultural land. We were sitting at about 4 hectares per person. As time marched on, in the 1960s, we're up to about 5 hectares per person. We are growing more agricultural land, but we're growing more people, but it increased. And since about 1960, the pattern is reversed, and we're now down to 2.3 hectares of agricultural land per person in the province of Alberta. That red bar you see at the bottom sits at 0.8 hectares per person. That is considered to be kind of the norm of how much agricultural land we would need at this latitude if we actually wanted to feed ourselves. Where does the graph take us? By 2055, as our population continues to increase and as our agricultural land continues to slide, we will, for the first time in a long time, become a net importer of agricultural products. We already import lots in Alberta today, it's just we export more than we import. We're not going to be an exporter. I think the Minister Olson was talking about how much of his professional political life is spent dealing with the needs of the crises of today, the tactical issues. And he mentioned how important it is for someone to have the conversation about the strategic, synoptic drivers. What about meat production? Here we're looking at supply in pink, demand. Demand continues to go up as the population goes up. And I'm assuming this model is making the assumption that people are going to eat the same proportion of meat in the future. That may not be true. But if they are, supply goes up, but demand goes up faster, and basically in about 3 decades, we would actually be in a situation where there's a deficit in terms of supply and demand. So we can't think that necessarily we're going to continue to be exporters the way we are today. Not as if our population continues to increase and our agricultural land continues to decline. All you need to know is those 2 variables and know which direction we're going. What about the numbers of farms? Because this speaks to intensity, the scale, to commercialization. Well, there's a time there weren't any farmers. And then we got up to, what, about 120,000 functional farms. We've lost the majority of those farmland continued to increase throughout that period of time. Just the number of farms went down. And of course, that spoke to, basically the loss of the mixed farm in Alberta as we know it then, and basically the arrival of corporate farms. One of the key things we saw is that the parcel size changed radically. So if you look at the amount of edge expressed in kilometers per square kilometer, a lot of these small farms became very, very large chunks of land and farm edge declined. Well, this is a landscape ecologist and me reminding us that farm edge creates some wonderful properties from the standpoint of ecological goods and services, but we're now dealing with such large units of land that we've lost the edge, the fence line, et cetera, et cetera. So fence line went from being nothing to way up here. We've actually lost, believe it or not, a lot of our functional fence line habitat area. So not just the fence, but the habitat area. So fence lines used to be habitat, but now we just don't allow them to occur. We've removed almost all of our fence line habitat. So this is the kind of farm that my parents grew up in and I spent time as a kid. We don't do the mixed farm the way we do right now. So if you're a boss tourist, if you're a cow in the province of Alberta, about half the provincial herd spends half of their life, if you were to ask every cow every day where they stand, in a feedlot situation in one form or another. So we might have this impression that cows are out there on native prairie or pasture, and they are to a degree, but ILOs, CFOs, and feedlots consume about half the existence of our cattle population today. Very effective way of growing a lot of cows. The small, as we talked, small mixed farm has become this, and the fence line habitat has changed. This is what a typical fence looks like in Alberta today. This is all agriculture, and one of, I think, the key things is we talk about agricultural sustainability, the titles of this gathering. All of that is agriculture. But I see much more similarity in some of these pictures to types of forestry than I do to this type of agriculture. It's an intensification description. If we look at biodiversity loss in Alberta based on Alberta agriculture data here and compare it to the ALCES result, we see basically the same map. Our loss of biodiversity in this province is tied primarily to agriculture. It's not tied to forestry, and it's not tied to the energy sector. And if you pick up any paper, provincial or municipal, provincial, national or international, and look at land use issues in Alberta, 9 out of 10 articles will be about the oil and gas sector, which I think can improve a lot. And I think there's not even enough attention on the oil and gas sector. But as a nerdy scientist like me, when I just crunch the numbers and I look at loss of ecological goods and services, what's the top 5 problems? Agriculture, followed by agriculture, followed by agriculture, followed by agriculture, followed by agriculture. Yet, the severely normal Albertan doesn't even have that conversation because agriculture isn't the land use in this province, it's a religion. And until people start treating it for what it is, we can't have the blunt conversation about why it's not going to serve us very well in the future if we continue on our path. These are the, quote, endangered, threatened, or species of concerns in the province of Alberta. They're not in trouble because of forestry or the oil and gas sector, for the most part. It's agriculture. One of my earliest memories, because I came from an agricultural family, was my agricultural cousins reminding me that water is a big problem because you can't grow crops in water. So I, like many kids of my age, spent my time on a tractor trying to figure out how to ditch that one pond to the next pond to the next pond to get it to the darn river so we could get rid of that horrible water so we could grow something useful. And we did the same with our loadic systems, with our creeks. And that's why these first order lentic and loadic systems have been so heavily mined out of our parkland and our prairie systems because we viewed them from an agricultural perspective as being fundamentally bad. Now, of course, we realize that they're phenomenally important recharge areas. And without them, we can't even have sustainable agriculture. So we've learned a lot of lessons. Here we're just looking at the total amount of standing water in some of our natural regions in Alberta. And some, like the Central Parkland shown in red, has declined so much. And same with our mixed grass prairies, while others, such as the northern mixedwood forests, have not changed much at all. We have re-engineered this province structurally, because water was our enemy from an agricultural production standpoint. We've also mined a lot of our above and below ground carbon because of intensive agriculture. So here we're looking at the total amount of carbon in our soils and in our vegetation in a place called Alberta. And over that period of time, you can see that those lines have changed. They've gone down. Why? Because of many things. Settlements, roads, the transportation network, forestry. But the single greatest contribution, the loss of 0.8 billion metric ton, is that of agriculture. They've all contributed. That's a $16 billion liability to the province of Alberta. Here's a map of it. 1910. As you can see that there's not really that much carbon in the Cordillera and the mountains. A lot of rock, and you can see the Precambrian shield up there quite nicely. Let's march forward. This is tons of carbon in the soil per hectare. And over the last 100 years, we can see how it's gone down. Now watch where. You can see some evidence in the forested areas. That's commercial forestry. The big loss is in the white area in intensive agriculture. I guess that's why we fertilize crops. Must have taken something out of them that required us to replace that. So, times have changed. We're now realizing that as we grew these commodities, and they always had to start at zero. There was a time we didn't produce any pigs or any cows or any crop, so they all started at zero and they've grown. And as they've grown, we've drawn down on a bank account. That's our bank account of natural capital. And Albertans like this group, I've just been amazed at how articulate the questions and answers have been here, are realizing that there's an imbalance. Yes, we want the jobs, royalties, and rents that go with commodity production. We want to raise cattle and poultry and pigs and crops and have natural gas and hardwood and softwood and everything else. But there's something else that's very important, and that's the ecological goods and services, and the balance is not there. So I don't think your conversation is an anti-business conversation at all. I think it's a pro-business conversation. We want business. What we got to do is redefine what successful business is. And it's one in which we put the commodities on the table, which have always been there quite well, but we also put on the ecological goods and services, the air, land, and water, and then we have leaders, politicians, policy people that find trajectories of land use through space and time that manage not only the conventional economic indicators, the jobs, royalties, and rents that give us GDP, but these other bank accounts that our grandkids want. The ones that guys like Don put on his table as indicators a long time ago. That's going to require new conversations. And I believe strongly that there is no smart scientist or consultant or anything else that can figure out how to do all of this where everyone can max all this stuff out. Everyone can do everything everywhere all the time. We can all grow at 7%. It isn't like that at all. This is all about tough decisions. It's about trade-offs, it's about limits, it's about risks, it's about knowledge. And we've all played that game. It's just we don't do it with land use. We play it with our spouses and our kids and our bank accounts and our 24 hours a day. We all know these things are finite. And if we draw more money out of our bank account than we put in, it goes down. And if I spend too much time with my wife, then I need to spend less time. If I don't spend enough, then I need to spend more time. It's all about trade-offs, right? We do it in so many other aspects of our life. But somehow with land use, we can have it all. Everything can grow. Well, it's not going to be like that. And the land use framework is intended to be that conversation that's looking for balance. Triple bottom line. Yeah, we want the jobs, royalties, and rents, but we want the ecological goods and services. That's going to require us to put new indicators on the table. We're going to need to reward land users for a broader suite of commodities than we have historically. It may even challenge this dogma in Alberta that we exist to feed the world. That we produce stuff and we just throw it out there because the world has more and more people. And we're not growing crops because we want money, right? We're growing it because we feel so badly about the starving people in Kenya. And if there's more,